Good morning, it's Dr. Driver here. This is from a talk I gave. I'm only going to talk to you really in any depth about Marie de France, whose fables we read earlier in the semester, and also Christine de Pizan. If you take my medieval women writers class sometime in the future, you'll get to hear about more of these ladies or more about these ladies. Okay, so I was interested in the way you can really extrapolate from what women writers talk about as to what they read. So I was interested in reconstructing their reading, the kinds of books they read, how what they read influenced them. Um, so the first woman writer I was talking about here, hold on, let me get this onto where is this thing? Um, Slideshow, yes. Okay, here we are, slideshow. First woman I'm talking about, or I was talking about in this lecture, is Heloise, who is the 12th century abbess who falls in love with her teacher, Abelard, with whom she has a child, but they both wind up writing and being involved more directly with the church. And they're buried together in Père Lachaise in Paris. In this, I think this is a 19th or possibly early 20th century tomb, but they were really remarkable writers, thinkers, and lovers. Heloise, I think, even more than Abelard um, in the 12th century. This picture introduces a section in this lecture on women troubadours who also composed songs and wrote again in the 12th century. And there are 20 of them that we know by name, and there are probably many more. So we have women writers operating really in southern France and northern Spain in the 12th century. Here's a picture of one of them, the Countess of Dia, a picture of another. Um, this is Castellosa. And then we get on to Marie de France, with whom we have some familiarity. She's the first named woman writer of vernacular narrative poetry in Europe. So we only know her first name. We don't know a lot about her. She too is 12th century, and she mentions herself by name in all three of her surviving works, which were composed between 1160 and 1215. She was clearly an aristocrat who inhabited a literate and literary world of stories, letter writing, and translation, but it's easier to trace Marie's sources, the stories she heard and the books she read, than to identify who she was. Like that of the women troubadours, Marie's work was clearly popular in her own day and well beyond. And we have some portraits of her, like this one, which attest to her authorship. She wrote three books. One is the Lays, or narrative poems, short narrative poems. One is the Fables, based on Aesop, and another is St. Patrick's Purgatory. Um, this picture shows Marie at work on her fables, and here's some pictures from the fables. Rather blurry here, sorry. This is in the main manuscript collection of Marie's works, which is in British Library. It's in the British Library. It's manuscript Harley 978, and it's a compilation copied in the third quarter of the 13th century. So this includes Marie's fables, of which there are 102, and these exist as well in 22 other manuscripts. So the longevity of these manuscripts suggests that Marie's work was very, very popular. And she takes her first 40 fables from the Romulus, which is a medieval story collection associated with Aesop. It's called the Romulus, that circulates from the 11th century in various versions. In her epilogue, Marie claims further that her French version of the fables was based on an English version made by King Alfred the Great in the 9th century. She calls him Lyre Alfred, Alfred the Great. This work is no longer extant, if ever it existed. It probably did exist, but we don't know. Her fables also show Marie's knowledge of the Roman du Renard, the Book of the Fox, which was a famous medieval collection about the trickster fox Reynard, and he becomes Don Russell in Chaucer's Nun's Priest Tale, as you may recall, along with medieval versions of Statius and Virgil, stories deriving from Ovid and popular folk tales. Marie's most famous work is the Lays, which are her narrative poems. And she says she's heard these stories. So these are folk tales, um, Very interesting. There's one that concerns a werewolf. It's the first known werewolf story. Um, and she writes a range of works. So we've got her consulting both written exemplars, written sources for her fables and her other book, The Purgatory, and the lays seem to have come from oral sources. Okay, I'm going to skip in this lecture over. Here's Julian of Norwich, very interesting woman who was attached to St. Julian's Church in Norwich, and her idea of God as the mother is still very influential today. Here's an anchoress. This is what Julian was. To find out more, take that class. Here's a funny church pew carving. This is to represent Marjorie Kemp, who was illiterate, but she learned by hearing. So she read by hearing, and she wrote her own autobiography, which is quite amusing. And here is Christine. So here's Christine. So Christine lives really in that twilight before the Renaissance gets going. She's born about 1364 or 5, and she dies in 1430 about. And she's the first professional writer in French literature to earn a living by her pen. This statement could be read both literally and figuratively, as Christine not only wrote books, she sometimes copied them out in her own hand. One of the ways in which people acquired books in the Middle Ages. So you want a book, you take it home, you copy it yourself. In Christine's case, the works we have that were physically written by her, so she's also a scribe, are copies of her own writings made for noble or wealthy patrons. And we know that she copied them because she says she does. Very unusual for scribes to identify themselves. Christine shares with Heloise fluency in several languages. Christine read Italian, French, and Latin. And she is a lover of lyric poetry, and she likes to retell stories she's heard. On the basis of Christine's autographs, those manuscripts she copied herself, it is sometimes surmised that Christine at first supported herself and her family as a scribe employed in the manuscript trade after her early widowhood. And you'll remember she was widowed very young. And she has to support her mother, her children, and a niece, as I recall. She does have 2 brothers who just go back to Italy. Her family comes originally from Italy, from Pisano in Italy. Anyway, there's some reason to believe that Christine read sources that later appear in her work while copying them for patrons or for Paris book dealers. It's also known that Christine ran her own scriptorium or scribal workshop to produce copies of her own works for royal and noble patrons. The most magnificent of these is British Library Harley Manuscript 4431, with its lavish frontispiece showing Christine offering her book to Queen Isabeau of Bavaria, which was completed after 1410 and partially copied by Christine herself. Christine's reading, which was encouraged by her father, was wide-ranging. Her father, Thomas de Pizan, originally from Bologna, took a position at the court of Charles V, moving his family with him to Paris. Charles V was an avid book collector, known for his library, which is partially housed in the Louvre, which you can still visit in Paris, once we can visit anything. Christine knew and apparently used the study or reading room above the king's library, which Christine wrote of as if from personal knowledge. She describes the desks and benches, the writing benches, and the wood paneling on the walls and the ceilings inlays of cypress wood. It's thought that Christine got access to the royal library through its librarian, whose name was Gilles Mallet, and she may also have borrowed books from some of her patrons, including the Dukes of Berry and Burgundy, and possibly even from Jean Gerson, the Chancellor of the University of Paris. Certainly, Christine often describes herself as a literate laywoman or as a learned writer impassioned with study. As we will see from this brief sample of her work as a reader, Christine apparently had boundless curiosity about many subjects. This is a very famous illumination from Christine's book. And here she's shown presenting her work in the boudoir of Isabeau of Bavaria. Christine's first foray into the world of French letters begins with a salvo against the Roman de la Rose, or the Romance of the Rose, the famous 13th century allegorical work that considers love from the sacred to the profane begun by Guillaume de Rorey and completed by Jeanne de Meaux. The Rose, she said, was misogynist, and indeed it is. Christine's criticism of the Rose in 1400 made her early literary reputation, yet she read the Rose really carefully, and the Roman de la Rose, the Romance of the Rose, influences all her subsequent writings. Her most famous work is the Book of the City of Ladies, written about 1404, which was inspired not only by St. Augustine's City of God, but by Giovanni Boccaccio's On Famous Women. Dante figures as a main source for Christine's Book of the Path of Long Study, and it's thought that Christine may have been the first writer to read Dante's work, and that's Dante Alighieri, who writes the Commedia, the Divine Comedy. She's the first one in France to read him. She also is influenced by Petrarch, the Italian poet, and in her religious writing. Her popular Letter of Otea to Hector, written about 1401, is a collection of moralized mythological stories drawn from the Ovid Moralisé, the Moralized Ovid, which was a popular medieval compilation of Ovid's Metamorphoses written in 72,000 lines of verse. The earliest known surviving manuscript of Christine's Letter of Otea is copied in Christine's own hand. She also writes a biography, and this is the first biography, I think, written in France. It's a biography of Charles V, and she consults various works for that, including the Great Chronicles of France and the Flowers of the Chronicles. In her Feats of Arms and Chivalry, a book about conducting warfare, Christine shows her knowledge of the works of the classical writers Vigilius and Fontinus, also drawing on the Tree of Battles by Henri Bouvet. So that's interesting. She writes a book about warfare very knowledgeably. So she knows about that, which is not something even women today know the details of to a large extent. Interesting. So this overview just shows the extent and range of Christine's reading. I think that's about all I've got to say about Christine. We're going to go on to student reports on Christine, I hope. But this gives you a little bit of an overview.